Hi there, Steve Kaufman again, and actually I'm going to change to these other glasses that are less reflective. I want to talk a little about the importance of being an independent learner, and this is one of the major attractions of input-based learning. So I'm going to stay on this subject. I just did a video on what I consider to be the advantages of listening and reading as opposed to focusing on output. And it has a lot to do with the importance of being independent. Because if you are worried about your output at an early stage in your language learning, if you want to practice output, who are you going to practice with? Most people don't want to talk to someone who can't speak very well or who has very few words. I don't like it when someone comes to me and says, "Can I practice my English on you?" and essentially can't say anything. I think it's an unreasonable expectation of someone. So you end up with a teacher. And again, I think it's unnecessary to be dependent on a teacher. If you want to practice your output on someone, you are dependent on their goodwill, that they are going to be patient and they're going to listen to you and try to understand what you're saying and speak slowly and stay within the range of the limited number of things that you can talk about. I prefer not to do that. I prefer to build myself up to a level where I can have a conversation with someone where I'm not a burden on them. And you never know what their reaction is going to be. I mean, some people are patient, some people are not patient. So learning via input, focusing on listening and reading, makes you more independent. And I think that is a major, major advantage. I don't need to go to a tutor. I can if I want, but I don't depend on the tutor. And the other thing about a teaching scenario is your traditional classroom is one of dependence. The learner is dependent on the teacher, and the teacher decides what the activities are going to be. And I know from having been on this listserv, the community of English teachers, they spend a lot of time talking to each other about how nice it was that they introduced poetry, or that they brought up some subject in their class on critical thinking, which forced the learners to question some aspect of our society and forced them to be critical thinkers. But maybe those learners were not interested in poetry, were not interested in the subject that you wanted them to become critical thinkers about, Mr. or Mrs. Teacher. So I think that one of the major disadvantages of a classroom is that the learners are so dependent. They just walk in there and sit down and wait for the teacher to take over. The big advantage of input-based learning is that you are in charge. You decide what you're going to listen to. You decide if you're going to spend the next hour listening or reading or going through flashcards or writing, or if you choose to contact, if you do have a language exchange partner, you can also contact the language exchange partner. But once again, once you're depending on someone else's goodwill, you are no longer quite so independent. So I think a major, major advantage of input-based learning is the fact that you become independent. And I think that, this is one of the themes in my book, it's so important to cultivate that capacity to be an independent learner, to explore the language on your own. I'm constantly surprised at people who are, as soon as they run into the first difficulty in a language, they want it explained. Why is this on our forum now in Russian, why are there not two dots over the E? Well, there just isn't. You'll get used to it. A lot of things that people ask questions about at an early stage, they eventually figure out themselves. Again, I find now that I've been in Russian, I've been doing it for 4 years now, an hour a day, mostly listening and reading, occasionally reviewing a grammar book. But I find it's very useful now to go back to my beginner books when I used to flip through and ignore the grammar because I couldn't remember it or make sense of it. And now I walk through that book. It takes me probably between half an hour and an hour to go through the whole book very quickly. But I find that I'm sort of confirming and nailing down all of these rules that were meaningless blurs to me before, because my emphasis has been building up my vocabulary through all my listening and reading activities, and being willing to live with a certain amount of uncertainty and lack of clarity in the text. And so now, as an independent learner, I choose now to go back there and try and nail down some of the grammar. Some of the grammar has already become second nature to me, but I do often pick up some other things. So I just want to make this point that one of the major advantages of what appears to be a passive way of learning is that you become independent. You're not forced to sit in a classroom where the teacher is going to have you role playing. And so, I had this great debate with the Canadian benchmark system, which is this thing that has been developed in Canada over 10 years and umpteen committee meetings and people traveling around the countryside. And they insist that any immigrant who is learning English is obliged to learn, as long as the government's paying for it, using a system called task-based learning, which means that the learner sits in the classroom and pretends to be a nurse or a checkout person in a supermarket or whatever other task they decide, the teacher decides. Or they might say, okay, what do you guys, ask the class, what do they want to, what kind of a task do they want to act out. But the point is that the decision on what to do in the classroom is with the teacher. And so the big advantage of input-based learning is that you decide what the learning task, what the learning subject matter is going to be. And that is a big advantage, because if you can develop that ability to be an independent learner, you will succeed more quickly than if you remain in the position of a dependent learner. Thank you for listening.